This is the third and the last part of this three-part lecture on diversity. And so in this last part, we consider a class analysis of poverty. And so we're moving from sort of background material into sort of the substance of policy. We look at anti-poverty strategies in the second half of the semester. And so now we're getting into poverty itself and explanations for poverty. We consider four different explanations for poverty. And so among those four explanations, two are centered on individual level factors. Two are centered on structural level factors. That's one dimension that we use in terms of our typology that we use here. Another dimension that we consider is whether we're looking at inherent characteristics of the individual or the social system, or do we look at sort of the incidental features or characteristics of the individual or social system. So those are a couple of different dimensions by which we classify these different explanations for poverty. So we start with our first explanation of poverty, attributing poverty to inherent individual level characteristics. This is the modern oligarchy type argument, suggesting that people are poor because of inherent characteristics, inherent flaws. More specifically, scholars in this camp, well, there aren't too many scholars in this camp, but if you subscribe to these notions, you might say that people are poor because of genetic predisposition, because of their lower IQ, for example. Of course, not too many scholars lay much importance on these explanations, but these explanations still exist, and they do receive much popular support. If you look at some of the public opinion polls as recently as the 1990s and the 2000s, upwards of 60–70% of people agree with statements linking poverty to genetic differences or IQ differences, or even linking IQ to race and so forth. So I throw this argument out there, this line of thinking out there, because I think the thinking is still prevalent today. The second explanation of poverty is looking once again at individual level factors, but not so much inherent characteristics of the individual, but looking at these sort of incidental characteristics. And specifically, this explanation centers on the value system of the poor. So the values, the norms, the beliefs that the poor have. The argument is essentially that people are poor because their value system doesn't fit the society, right? So the poor are too lazy, they're too present-oriented, they don't know how to delay gratification, they suffer from low self-esteem. This type of explanation. So this is also called the culture of poverty thesis, suggesting that there's a culture among the poor, a culture that's characterized by these values and norms. There are different versions of this explanation. In the strongest versions, there's an emphasis on intergenerational transmission, that basically that poverty gets passed down from one generation to the next, that this value system gets passed down from one generation to the next, and hence we have continuing poverty, or the cycle of poverty. There are more moderate versions of this explanation which don't necessarily look at the transmission of poverty from one generation to the next, but just looking at one generation, or the current generation, attributing poverty to the lack of role models, for example. So suggesting that people are poor because they didn't have the right role models to teach them the proper value system, the values that would help them get ahead in life. And so if we're looking for solutions to poverty, that's sort of the corollary here. So in terms of solutions, what sort of solutions might be out there here? Well, you have to change the value system, right? This is akin to the thinking that the COS, or the Charity Organization Society workers had in mind in addressing poverty, that you had to change the individual, that you had to change the belief systems that were in place. The next explanation, now we're shifting to structural explanations. The third explanation is centered on, not once again, but now we're looking at structural level factors, but not so much at inherent features of the social system, but as sort of incidental byproducts of the social system. So this is the most popular explanation among social scientists, suggesting that poverty is rooted in the opportunity structure, that people are poor because some just didn't have the same opportunities that others had. And so one explanation historically that some scholars may offer is that we had a changing economy. Specifically, if you look at the economy of the 1960s, the manufacturing jobs, the factory, the low-skilled jobs moved out of the inner cities, out to the suburbs, and in the process, the people who were displaced, the people who were left unemployed in the inner cities, didn't have the right skills to meet the types of jobs that were becoming available. That is, the service center jobs, the service sector jobs, in other words. And so this is one explanation for poverty. So if we think that poverty is rooted in changes in the economic structure, that poverty is rooted in the mismatch between the types of jobs that are available and the skills that people have to offer in the inner cities, for example, then certainly the solution here is going to be to address that mismatch, right? So either we need to create more jobs, maybe in the way of greater public spending or public works projects, or maybe you need to give people the right type of skills to fit the jobs that are available. So education, more training programs, those would be seen as possible solutions. The current day version, I mean, we can think of the outsourcing that companies are doing. This is abroad, right? Sending jobs overseas, and the displacement of jobs and the skills that people have to offer. If you're talking about a car manufacturing company that outsources to another country, then the low-skilled workers, of course, their skills aren't going to necessarily match the service sector jobs that become available in that particular area that's been displaced. There's a conservative version of this line of thinking, and that's centered not so much on changes in the economic structure, but on changes in the political structure, or maybe in the political, just not necessarily the changes, but the political system that we have in place. And namely, this is Charles Murray's argument, suggesting that poverty is rooted in the welfare system that we had. So back in the 1960s and into the 70s, when welfare benefits became more and more generous, it was sort of poverty was sort of an incidental byproduct of the structure that we had in place. We had man-in-the-house rules. We were offering greater benefits, of course, to single-parent families, and so that's seen as the root of poverty. And of course, if we're looking at solutions, to poverty, naturally the solution there would be to get rid of the system that we have. And so we, of course, did that in 1997 when we displaced the old system, the old welfare system, with the current TANF system that we have in place. The last explanation is rooted in Marxist thinking. So this is, we're now looking at inherent properties of the social system. And so here you would be looking at the class structure, that you have the bourgeois or the upper class, you have the proletariat and the lower class, that there's class exploitation, that one particular class, the upper class, actually benefits from the existence of poverty. I think that's the root argument that's being offered here, that it's not a simple byproduct of economic changes or the structure of our welfare system, but it's rooted in our capitalist system, is the argument. It's the idea that there are people in our society, the upper class, the bourgeois, that actually benefit from the existence of society. That's the main argument. One example of this line of thinking might be if you're thinking in terms of corporations and the fact that they're trying to minimize costs, right? The whole premise is profit maximization there. And so to minimize costs, there might be an outsourcing of jobs like we just alluded to before overseas, in which case you're looking for the lowest cost labor. And so that's the system that we have in place, a capitalist system that's based on profit maximization of firms on the firm side. And so clearly, if the problem is rooted in the capitalist structure, the solution then will be doing something about that capitalist system. At the most extreme, we might offer to get rid of that capitalist system, right? That would be the most extreme solution, but more practically speaking, we need to do something about that capitalist system. So scholars in this camp might argue for greater labor unions, greater strength or powers of labor unions to help protect workers in terms of wages, in terms of working conditions. So this is Marxist. This is in line with Marxist type thinking. So in sum, we have 4 different explanations for poverty: 2 rooted in individual level factors, and 2 in structural level factors. And so we'll stop there. And next week we'll get into a more technical discussion of poverty.